What is the craziest story you have of your ancestor? Story 1. My great-grandfather was from a wealthy family back in Greece, Albania in the 1890s. He had a tryst with a peasant girl who got pregnant. Rather than marry the peasant girl, the family arranged for my great-grandfather to be sent to America. Not to be outdone, the peasant girl and her family saved up enough money and sent her to America after him. She found him in New York, and they got married there. Story 2. My grandfather, born in 1889, grew up on a farm. One day, he and his brother were digging out a tree stump using mattocks, each one swinging alternatively from the opposite side. His brother mistimed a downswing and clocked my grandfather on the head. His father put some kind of liniment on the wound and put him to bed. When my grandfather woke up the next morning, he was blind. His father thought he was faking it to get out of doing his chores and told him to get to work. My grandfather felt his way out to the barn and fed the sheep. And by then, his father realized he was telling the truth. His sight returned in a few days. My grandfather went on to become a doctor and realized that the blow from the mattock had damaged the optic nerve. Fortunately, not permanently. He served as an army doctor in France during World War I, when he also had to deal with the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. Story 3. My grandfather was posted as missing in action, believed to be killed in World War I. My grandmother was expecting their first child. That usually meant they were actually killed, so grandmother was certain that she would never see him again. Then there was a knock at the door, and grandfather was standing there in the hospital blue uniform soldiers wore to show they were receiving treatment. He had been knocked unconscious by the explosion everyone thought him and sent to a hospital close to his home without being identified. When he came around and was otherwise unhurt, they gave leave to go home before being sent back to the front. Grandmother went into slightly early labor caused by the shock. Granddad survived the war. My grandmother and the baby were both okay, and all lived quite long and healthy lives. Similar story. My great-uncle was at Pearl Harbor, and his cousin was too. My great-uncle survived, and his cousin did not. They were very similar looking, and the government thought my uncle had died and notified his wife. She had quite the surprise when he made it home. Story 4. My great-great-grandfather was the first convict sent to Australia to be freed after serving his time. He went on to develop the wheat that we grow here. European wheat died. My great-great-grandfather was also arrested and exiled to Australia when it was a penal colony. The story goes that he led a successful prison break on the ship and they sailed to North America where my distant relative made off with the valuables from the captain's quarters, purchased a slave as a traveling companion, and eventually settled somewhere in Canada and freed his companion. The only evidence I could find to support my family's story was a family of famous black pro athletes with my family's aggressively Welsh last name. I'd like to know more, but the remainder of the family has either passed or is estranged. Story 5. My great-grandfather came home early from work one day to find his wife in bed with the milkman. Or mailman, I can't remember. Either way, there was a scuffle and the mailman went out the bedroom window and died 2 days later in the hospital. This happened in the same house that I grew up in because the house was in my family for a very long time. I tried looking up news articles and such on the incident, but was never able to find anything. This was a common discussion at parties with my family, and I always tried to learn more about my great-grandfather. Turns out he was an undertaker. Go figure. Story 6. The only famous relative I have was barred by an act of parliament from ever again being the warden of a prison due to massive corruption. Do you have any idea how corrupt you would have to be specifically called out for corruption in 18th century Britain? It's kind of impressive in its own way. Story 7. My grandpa beat Rod Laver in a tennis match when he was a teenager and was going to be sponsored by Dunlop, but his parents were wealthy and thought tennis was silly with little money at the time, so he didn't pursue it. Now there's a stadium named after Rod Laver. Story 8. My grandmother's grandmother walked the Trail of Tears. Her parents did not make the walk, assumed dead. When she reached Oklahoma, she was adopted by a white couple. She was put down as half Cherokee, half white on the roll because of this. Story 9. Maternal grandmother's parents met in a train wreck. Great-grandpa was traveling second class with a window seat. Great-grandma was traveling coach. Something was on the tracks causing a derailment and many injuries. Great-grandma, being seated further back, was fine and pitched in to help those in need. Great-grandpa had hit the window and his ear was cut very badly, almost sliced off his head. Almost. She was tearing off strips of her petticoat to use as bandages. Ooh la la. Until he died, he teased that his left ear was lower than his right because she put it on wrong. Story 10. My grandfather's grandfather was found wandering naked in a forest. He was estimated to be around 8 or 9 years old. He didn't speak, but understood when spoken to. After a few years, he started talking, but was never able to recall anything about his life before he was found by the family that took him in. My great-great-great-grandparents. They raised him as their own, and all the stories say he turned out pretty normal. Story 11. Grandpa was shot in the head on the Russian front. He was German. He was declared dead and put on a pile of dead bodies. A friend of his, who grew up in the same village as my grandpa, went to the pile to give him the last goodbye, and he saw my grandpa was shaking a little bit. He yelled at the doctors, "This man is not dead!" And yeah, the doctors got him out of the pile and actually rescued him. But they couldn't remove the bullet in his head. It was too dangerous. So my grandpa lived with this bullet in his head his whole life. He was not able to get a driver's license due to the risk of epileptic shocks. He named his son, my father, after the man who rescued him. Story 12. My grandfather was born in Poland. He was around 16 when the wars broke out, and because he was a fit, healthy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed farmer boy, he was sent to work in German farms. Before that, though, he was put into a concentration camp while they figured out where to send all their new slaves. During this time, his older brother actually escaped. My grandfather says he stole a gun, climbed the fence, tanked the cuts from the barbed wire, and just ran. He made the escape with a few other people, but all but 2 of them were killed. My grandfather was supposed to join them, but he said he just froze and chickened out. His brother later joined some battalion, where he later died fighting Nazis. My grandfather was eventually moved to a small town in Germany and was housed with landowners who grew some sort of crop. He was set to work. This small town was actually secretly against the war, though, and the family he stayed with used their house as a safe house to smuggle Jews. They had the whole hidden room under the floorboards thing. Luckily, they were never discovered. They, and a few other families in the town, wanted my grandfather to marry their daughters and stay in Germany. He did stay in Germany for a few months. He said he also joined the Peace Corps. Once he had his fill of that, he simply jumped on the first boat out of there with nothing but his tool belt and the clothes on his back. That boat went to Australia, which was where he met my grandmother, and yada yada yada, I was born. He had such a fascinating, terrifying life, full of turmoil and danger, but one thing never left him: his passion for plants. Right up until the week he passed away at age 86, he was still climbing ladders to trim his trees, hand-pollinating all of his bean plants with a feather, and shooting Indian mynas out of the tree with his slingshot to let the native birds have the nest. Story 13. I'm 34, but my paternal grandfather was born in 1895. He got shot through both knees sideways in Belgium during World War I, then had to limp miles to safety. Sounds impossible, but I have a newspaper article about it. His brother also survived World War I, only to die in the Spanish flu epidemic. Sadly, my grandfather died quite a while before I was born. Story 14. Dutch here. My maternal grandfather was part of a group of people that hid Jews and allies in a hidden village, underground house, made in the woods during World War II. They were later discovered by the SS, but they still managed to save a lot of people. To this day, you can visit the remains of the hidden village to see what it was like. Story 15. My great-great-grandmother was Winston Churchill's parlor maid. When she left service to get married, he begged her to stay as he was fond of her. And when she said no, he gave her a table and chair from his own parlor as a wedding gift. My parents have the chair in my mom's office, and the table is currently in storage. Story 16. My dad's aunt was living in Messina, Italy in the early 1900s. In 1908, there was a huge earthquake that destroyed half the city, and she was stuck under the rubble for 3 whole days right next to the bodies of her parents and 3 brothers without being able to move an inch. When she was found, she didn't even have a broken bone, and went on to have 10 children of her own and die at 97 years old. Story 17. I have 2 that are somehow connected. My great-grandfather, during World War II, lived through some wild shit. He was sent to the Gulag and escaped from the transport somewhere in today's Belarus. He then returned home on foot to the middle of northern Poland where we live today. If you want a more exact location, Google where my town Szczecin is. After a few years, in the middle of which my grandpa was born, he was taken to serve in the German army. He was based somewhere in Norway and escaped once again, but not before he blew up the warehouse with weapons he was kinda in charge of. On a lighter, funny AF note, he was one of 13 children. His mother, my great-great-grandmother, named her second child Stanislaw and named her last child Stanislaw. She had so many children that she forgot she already used that name. The second Stanislaw sadly didn't live through infancy. Story 18. Che Guevara taught my grandfather to play chess. His father used to get into bar fights with Pancho Villa. And my family's last name exists because two Scottish brothers got drunk, stole a cannon from the local militia armory, and accidentally shot the steeple off the local church. While hauling ass out of Scotland, they told their kids, if anyone asks who you are, just say you're German and pretend you don't know English. They didn't know German either. Story 19. My granddad was an engineer for the British Army in Egypt during World War II. He had a buddy and got drunk one time and slept in this small town. When they awoke, they discovered the Germans had taken over the town. So they evaded capture and discovered an old plane that required maintenance. The two ended up repairing the plane and flew it over German lines and into Allied territory. Story 20. My great-grandfather hunted down and killed 3 men who were responsible for killing his brother. My family on my grandmother's side comes from somewhere in Italy. Well, way back in the day, my great-grandfather and his brother owned a renovation and restoration business. They were hired to do some work in the Sistine Chapel, along with a second team that was meant to set up the equipment they would be using. Scaffolding and stuff like that. Well, at one point they had gotten into an argument, and the other contractors chose to roll back some of their safety features on their scaffolding. And when my uncle was working on the scaffolding, it gave out and fell, and he died on the floor of the Sistine Chapel. The 3 men on the other crew fled before the accident, prompting my great-grandfather to hunt them down across Italy and kill them off one by one. When he finally returned home several days later and confessed everything to his mother, she ordered him to flee to the United States so he wouldn't get arrested. And he did. That's how that part of my family came to America. Story 21. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was abducted by pirates as a boy and raised as one in Canada. They were river brigands. My mom has a book on him. Her parents were from Czechoslovakia and Germany though, so I'm not sure how that happened. I always told people I was part pirate though. Story 22. One of my ancestors was Curly Bill Brocious, the leader of the infamous Cowboys gang which fought against the Earps in and around Tombstone, Arizona in the 1870s and 80s. He was killed by Wyatt Earp himself by a shotgun blast that reportedly tore him in two. Story 23. One of my great-grandmothers climbed on top of Mount Blanc in 1942, during the German occupation of France. On top of that, she did it while wearing a dress. We have pictures of it in my family. Story 24. My grandma, mother's side, was abandoned in an orphanage by my great-grandmother because she wanted to run off and marry another man, and he would not take her children. So my great-grandfather, who was in the army during World War I, came to see them and promised to come back after the next battle. It was the Somme. He died. The same grandmother did not know how old she was. By the time she obtained a copy of her birth certificate later in life, she found out she was a year older than she thought she was. My dad's grandfather was an advertising artist, semi-famous at the time. There is an original of his passed down in our family. It's with my dad's oldest brother now. It is of a boy running down a famous road in my northern city past a famous theater still being used to this day. Story 25. One of my great-grandmother's grandma was an aristocrat. She fell in love with a peasant boy working on their lands. Her father told her he would disown her if she wanted to be with that boy. So one dark night the boy got my grandma, escaped from their home, and they ran away. Needless to say, she was disowned. And that is the story of why I have to work now, instead of just seeing my monthly allowance to show up on my bank account. Story 26. My grandfather during World War II. He was born in 1908, so lived through both world wars, and since we lived in Moselle, northeast of France, he lived in occupied territory from the beginning every time, and spoke perfect German. He was a mechanic, so when Germany invaded the second time, he was put to work fixing vehicles. Except he pretended to not understand a single word of German. The soldiers always took so long explaining to him what needed to be done, and he would mess up. Whatever could be an honest mistake without being in too much danger. The commander hated him for all of this, but needed the skills since he was good. At the end of the war, when they received the orders to retreat, my grandfather gave them a farewell speech in the best, most well-spoken German possible, basically saying, you, goodbye. The second in command was so furious about being made a fool all this time that he reached for his gun but was stopped by his chief because it was not worth it, and they were running out of time. Story 27. My great-grandmother was reportedly the oldest woman to ever live in Lebanon. Depending on who you ask, she was anywhere between 112 to 118 years old. She's commemorated on a stamp, so I guess the government acknowledged that the claim was true. Interestingly enough, she was a short, morbidly obese woman almost her entire life. Story 28. My grandparents lived in Cologne at the end of the war. During an attack, my grandfather went back to the house and was hit. Seems the wound caused an infection. Shortly afterwards, the Americans took over Cologne, and someone talked to him and told them that he had been against the Nazis and had even lost his job because of that, and they gave him the medicine, penicillin, that probably saved him. I wish they hadn't. Not being a Nazi was his only redeeming quality, and he had a very negative impact on many lives. Story 29. During the partition of India in 1947, my grandmother and her family, Sikh, lived in a village with Hindus, Sikhs, and one Muslim family. During the brutality of it all, people in the village wanted to attack the Muslim family, but my great-grandfather intervened and stopped them from being hurt. He then helped them leave the village to make their way to Pakistan from the Indian side of the Punjab where my grandmother's village was. We still do not know to this day what happened to the Muslim family and whether they survived. Story 30. Nazis came knocking on my grandparents' doors saying, "We know you are harboring the local resistance here. We are coming in." He let them search, looked at the officer, and said, "I have a 1.5-year-old and a 2-month-old. I would never do anything to jeopardize them." It scared my grandmother so bad, she couldn't produce milk for my then 2-month-old dad. Luckily, her best friend also had a child, so she played nursemaid. That night, the 3 local Greece resistance leaders crawled out of the hidden room in the basement and escaped into the mountains. My papaw had of steel. Story 31. My grandfather was doing construction work in the Midwest US in the early 60s. One day on a job site, he found a small tin box buried in the ground. He stuffed it in his coat or shirt, out of sight, and told no one until he got home, where he told my grandmother. For fear it had been a stash belonging to a nefarious character that might come looking, they decided to keep it secret, keep it safe. Gandalf the Grey. They encased it in a closed cement cinder block and left it in a corner of the garage. They never ever told their daughter, my mother, what was inside the tin secreted away in the cinder block in the corner of the garage. Years later, in the late 60s, my grandfather passed away when my mother was 17 or 18. The cinder block was forgotten and sat for decades in the corner of the garage. Now skip forward to the early 2010s. My mother, now married to my father for almost 40 years, still did not know about the stash. My grandmother, now in her 90s, had a decline in health and had to sell her home and move into a senior living facility. Because of her poor health, she was not able to be present at her home for moving day. She told my dad several times, in no unclear terms, "Make sure you take the cinder block in the corner of the garage. It's very valuable." So of course, my dad very nearly forgets about it and or shrugs it off as the ravings of an unwell 90-year-old woman. At the last second, as we're shutting the U-Haul door, he remembers the block and his mother-in-law's words. He sighs, opens the truck, and sets the block inside. The cinder block eventually ends up, you guessed it, in the corner of my parents' garage, forgotten again. Several years pass. And in September of 2012 or 13, so does my grandmother. Thanksgiving comes around, late November, and my parents and all their kids are home. My dad tells us he has a surprise for us and takes us into the garage where there's a cinder block sitting on the floor with a hammer, chisel, a sledgehammer, and a few other miscellaneous tools. The cement was old and pretty brittle, and just a few taps in the right spot cracked it open. Inside, a dirty old rotted cloth, wrapped loosely around the dingy tin my grandfather found over 5 decades prior. We opened up the tin, and what we discovered? It was completely full of gold coins. My brother-in-law was a bit of a coin collector and identified a few right then, saying they had some significant value. I don't know how much it really added up to, with my parents keeping financial information to themselves, and it was their property, but just on the weight of the gold alone, We estimated their value around $250,000. It would be more if any of the coins had any value for collectors. I guess my grandma actually had this story left to my mom and dad in a letter when she passed, and that's how we learned the full details of how it happened when the cinder block had seemed forgotten for so long. Hope you enjoyed it.